Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called Identity Politics and Jazz. Right, so I'm staring straight into the camera now and I'm wondering whether I will even put this video up, okay? Because I know in discussing this I could easily stray into areas which are so hot culturally at the moment that I could get a lot of pushback, which I don't want on my channel. I want a nice happy channel. I want everyone coming along and checking my videos out. Okay, I don't want anybody hating my guts because I dared to discuss identity and jazz, right? But when I am talking about jazz, this is in the back of my mind all the time. And there's a recent comment about plagiarism, and it was about sort of white people plagiarizing black artists, which is an idea that has come out of identitarian thinking. And I sort of joke, they were talking about the sort of white artists that plagiarise bebop. And I sort of said, well, what about Sonny Stitt, who really came in and really copied what Charlie Parker. And you go, no, Stitt was a great artist. He was a great artist. But did he scout other artists that were influenced by Charlie Parker and emulated what he did who weren't black? I find that troublesome. And this is something that I sort of watched emerge in the 1980s when Wynton Marsalis emerged. That the narrative around how we assess jazz changed and an identitarian thing came in. By identitarian, I mean identity politics. You know, that the idea of the reduction of people to gender or class or race, and then using that as the fundamental structure for assessing something, which has really come out of a mixture of postmodernist philosophy and critical theory that has its roots in a sort of reassessment of sort of Marxist ideas. Of course, Marx was the originator of reducing everything to two identity groups, you know, the privileged and the non-privileged, you know. And privilege plays a really important part in the assessment of this, right? So what I'm going to do on this video, if I show it, if you're watching it, then I've had plucked up the courage to put it on, right, is I want to come at this from a different angle, so people don't go, oh my God, what is he saying? Is he a racist? Right, I want to come at it at a different angle to hopefully make you realise that my problem with it is, to me, it seems incredibly racist. But of course, my idea of what racism is a product of my time, where I believe that we can define what racism is very simply. It's defining, it's making an assumption or associating characteristics of any kind to an individual based upon their race. You know, so if you meet someone in a certain race, you go, oh, they must be this. Positive or negative, that's racism to me. And it's as simple as that. And I found that personally has worked really well for checking whether things are racist or not. But I feel that the identitarians have changed the very nature of the definition of race. And it's much more associated with the idea of essentialist privilege embodied with a certain group. So if you're of a certain group, you have a certain embodied lack of privilege or a certain embodied privilege. And that embodiment of these sort of characteristics to assigned identity groups, for me, seems extremely prejudiced and racist for a whole number of reasons. One of them is because you're judging the individual based upon characteristics you've given the group. And the second thing is that how you're going to decide who fits in that group anyway. You know, because I believe people are individuals and nobody fits snugly into any group, right? That's my problem with this. But I want to come across this from another approach. I want to talk about why I love jazz so much, okay? My dad was a big jazz fan, He had a whole ton of records when I was growing up. And he was very good teacher, my dad was. So he was able to put these jazz albums on when I was, 5, 6, 7 years old, and he would explain them to me. He would explain these Count Basie albums, these Duke Ellington's albums, these albums by Modern Jazz Quartet, by Miles Davis, by Dave Brubeck, by Jerry Mulligan, by Chico Hamilton, by Jimmy Giuffre. These are the albums I grew up listening to. And my dad would explain their greatness to me. And so I had an understanding of jazz from early on, which I think a lot of people have to try and develop. I was quite home listening to jazz. My dad would say to me things like, listen to them play the tune. Right, now keep humming the tune in your head, and you will see they are now playing against that tune. They're weaving around it in your head. And I realised that to listen to jazz, I needed to hold things into my head. Right? It wasn't just about listening to what was coming out the speakers. I had to hold structures in my head and then to understand what the musicians were doing. And I had that from an early age. In doing that, I was astonished. Right? Growing up, there was Shakespeare, and there was Beethoven and Bach, and there was Rembrandt. These are the great artists that I was brought up with. But I also felt that there was another set of equally great artists. Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, Louis Armstrong. They were equally as great. They were like today's Bach or Beethoven. In the 70s when I was going through this, some of these guys were still alive, or they'd only recently died. This wasn't like history. Okay? And so every now and then, these artists would appear on the television, and I can remember the feeling of seeing someone like Duke Ellington on the TV. That feeling of going, oh my God, this is one of the greatest artists that's ever lived. He's the guy who made that record, and he plays piano on that, and he wrote that, and my God, that there he is. He's actually real. There's a real person there that is just so incredibly great. And I really had this strong feeling of this. And when I got to around about the age of 12, Oscar Peterson had his own show on originally on BBC Two, and then it moved to Channel 4, where he would interview jazz greats. And I can remember I would look at Oscar Peterson and go, there's one of the greatest musicians that ever lived. Now at the time I was listening to heavy metal, Led Zeppelin, Judas Priest. But I would watch this television programme and go, there's one of the greatest musicians that ever lived. Look at his hands. Listen to him talk. He knows so much about everything. I was immensely impressed by these musicians. Now, I don't even want to say this next statement because to me it seems so offensive that I would even have to state this in a modern era. But it never occurred to me that these musicians were black. Right? I was aware that they were American. I was aware that they were of Afro-American origin. I was aware of their culture and what that had played. But that was the same way as I was aware that Goya was a Spanish person and Picasso was Spanish, and that Spanish culture had informed them. Right? But back in the 70s, this identitarian narrative had not emerged. So to me, these artists were just the greatest artists of all time. All right? I got into music and I eventually found my way to jazz, and I was listening to a ton of jazz. And again, the same thing would happen, except in this case, I didn't know what Tony Williams looked like, and I didn't care what Tony Williams looked like. I didn't know what Jack DeJohnette looked like. To me, Tony Williams, he could have been white with that name. Jack DeJohnette, was this a French guy perhaps? Did Miles Davis has some French guy on drums playing incredible, right? When I eventually got to see these people on the television, if there was a concert, and around about 84, 85, BBC Two had, it was a celebration of Blue Note Records, and it had Herbie Hancock on there. I think Freddie Hubbard was on there, Tony Williams, Cecil McBee, Ron Carter. And that was the first time I'd ever seen Tony Williams. Again, when I saw him, I was like, oh my God, that's Tony Williams. That's what Tony Williams looked like. But never ever did I put any racial framework around who he was. I was looking at an individual. I wasn't looking at a black man or a white man. I was looking at an individual. Now the thing is, as I got older, I realised that there was something inherent in jazz music that actually cultivated this. Because what jazz was not a black music or an Afro-American music. It was a music created in America by Afro-Americans that had a certain quality about it. And the quality was, it was a set of rules, musical rules, where you could create improvised music that was as high artistically as classical music, but that anybody could get involved in from any background. I was very aware that the musicians that were playing it and had pioneered it were virtuoso musicians who had the whole of music history behind them. I felt like if you listen to someone like Charlie Parker, that Charlie Parker was bringing in ideas from classical music, especially impressionist composers, Debussy and Ravel. He was bringing in stuff from Stravinsky rhythmically. I didn't feel that this was an African music form. But African music was in there. When I heard Coltrane doing my favourite things, it sounded like he was drawing upon Indian music, and he was allowed to bring Indian music in because this form was alive. It was very, very special because it allowed everybody to operate as an individual within a system. In a way, it was an artistic embodiment of liberal democracy. Now this is the complete opposite to sort of critical theory, neo-Marxism, post-Marxism, postmodernism, critical race theory. It's a complete opposite. Those two ideas would not align if you tried to get them together, but they have been pushed together. And since the 1980s, there has been the idea that this is a black American art form which has to be judged within that these are great black artists, that this is great black music. And in that, it's almost wound in this idea of authenticity, right? That to play jazz, you have to be authentic. Okay, now this is a thing that's crept into all music criticism, right? I don't believe that any of jazz is authentic whatsoever. That's not the genius of it. The jazz is like a nuclear reactor fusion of music forms. It was that in 1910, it was that in 1920, it was that in 1930. It was like that thing that's on Back to the Future in the car, you know, and they stick the banana in it, that fusion machine, right? That's what jazz is. You take the elements around you, you bang it in, right? It's nothing to do with purity. Nothing to do with purity. It creates new forms, right? When you're listening to jazz records in 1920s, what you're hearing is new forms of music that are just being created. They do not relate to African music or Indian music or marching music or American folk music or country music. They don't relate to those forms as the next stage. This is something new, and these musicians that created it need to get the kudos for creating this incredible thing that's entirely new. It's a new way of creating music where you can put these elements in and something completely new comes out, right? The musicians that did this, oh, I'll just kick the camera. Sorry. The musicians that did this were incredibly educated. Now, I feel that when I've read the post-1980s critical view of a Duke Ellington or a Louis Armstrong, I've Googled this. If you put Louis Armstrong and put innate talent, that phrase will crop up over and over again. It's the idea that Louis Armstrong didn't know what he was doing. It came from his soul. It was an expression of this sort of Rousseauian idea of the noble savage. This is one of the most racist ideas I can ever think of, right? Louis Armstrong knew more about harmony than me. He was a better reader than me. He had more technique on his classical instrument that he played than I have on the drums. That guy was a fully formed musician, right? Where had this come from in jazz? This had come from the New Orleans orchestras that had emerged after the Civil War but before Jim Crow, where a whole bunch of musicians were highly trained in classical technique, right? And it's the marriage of classical technique, which then these musicians were, through Jim Crow, was then not allowed to play in European orchestras. And they had to go into a whole bunch of different areas musically, including minstrelsy. You know, jazz has its roots. This great innovation has its roots in minstrelsy. Okay? And that technique and that knowledge forged with a whole bunch of folk forms that we don't really know anything about. American folk forms, this has been going for too long. This isn't African music. This isn't the music of Congo Square coming through. The music of Congo Square has already morphed into all sorts of different things, and it's twisted. This is the whole thing I've learned about looking at music history, is it morphs and it twists and it's not what you expect. By the time we record it, and you've got to understand, recording music in the 1920s affects jazz greatly. Once these improvising musicians that can turn on a sixpence, you know, they can operate because they're improvisers. As soon as they've got into the studio changes what they do. They start to arrange what they do. They change the organisation of sound, and so it will be recorded better. They start to use the recording technology as a structure. Classical can't do that. If you're performing Debussy, you've got to play that. You can't change it or shorten it or add something to it or put a voiceover or some sound effects on it. Jazz, you could do all that with. This is the great innovation of jazz. It's not an authentic form, right? As soon as this emerges, there are plenty of white, highly educated, privileged people that will then start to go looking for authenticity in that style of music. Okay, I really feel like this happened with this sort of with people like Alan Lomax and John Hammond going looking for that type of authentic voice, black voice, right? I think this was so important to the development music, and we've got to thank these people for doing it, but it is driven by a slightly sort of Rousseauian racist view of what jazz and blues is, and the idea of Big Bill Broonzy up in New York with his sharp suit on, making some of the most hippest modern music, hearing that there's white people looking for proper blues back down south, so he runs back down there and he puts the overalls on and sticks this piece of straw in his mouth and gives them what they want, right? That has always been there. Never trust anybody who's into Americana. If they've got a beard and a waistcoat, what are they pretending to be? Right? And I'll tell you what they really will be. Privileged middle class people. That's what they'll be. Right? But jazz can accommodate privileged middle class people. It can accommodate uneducated people. It can accommodate people of any gender, any sexual orientation. It can accommodate people from any part of the world, with any background, with anything, as long as they understand the rules that have been created, right? And they abide by those rules. They have freedom. And jazz has renegotiated those rules. So there's styles where those rules can be huge, right? And we can create incredible music by really jumping through a lot of rules, hoops. That's like bebop. Or you can have like free jazz where it's almost like there's no rules at all. All that is contained within jazz. The idea that we can reduce anything down to identity groups, I feel is a limitation, which I feel rubs up against jazz. Okay, once jazz emerges, the racism at the times means that the white artists and the black artists can't work together. So a musician like Bix Beiderbecke, who worshipped Louis Armstrong, could never get to play with him, but they did get together and jam up. They did play together, and they both really respected each other. Right? What Bix Beiderbecke did was important to the development of jazz history. Okay? As jazz emerges and spreads out across the world, in the 1930s we start to get our first non-Afro-American, non-American jazz artists that really change the history of jazz. And of course, the first group really to do that would be the Hop Club of France with Stefan Grappelli and Django Reinhardt. Right, Django's importance in the history of jazz is equal to anybody else. All the way through the history of jazz, there has been the plagiarists and the copyists, right? All the way through there has been the innovators, okay? There has been appropriation of what black musicians did because of the racism of the time. You know, big bands like Count Basie and Duke Ellington were never as successful as the Benny Goodmans and the Artie Shaws. And that is pure racism, and we can deconstruct that and see what was going on, right? But we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a whole host of musicians that have played their part in the history of jazz, okay? And this was really shown out by, as soon as, I don't even want to talk about bands as being mixed race bands. Like, I find it offensive, right? I find it offensive that there's, if a jazz group is all white, then, but if they've got two black guys in it, that somehow makes that band better. It shouldn't be the case, but you'll feel that in the criticism, you know. When you watch the Ken Burns documentaries, the white artists are always shown discussing how their influence had come from black artists. Of course, early on, that was the only thing that could have happened. But the amount of musicians that were influenced by Big Spiderbeck, that were influenced by the Hot Club of France, also influenced by Benny Goodman. And Benny Goodman, you know, was one of the first guys to run. I'm about to do this now to justify this, and I don't like it. But, you know, in the 30s, he had an interracial small group. He wasn't allowed to do it as his big band, but he had an interracial small group with Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson, two of the most important players of the history of jazz, along with him and Gene Krupa. Gene Krupa's influence on not just jazz but popular music is immense. Right, so I think we need to stop looking through jazz through the lens of identity, and we need to start looking at these people as individuals and what they did and treat them in that way. Because that is the only way we could truly understand not just what these people did, but it's the only way their importance to history of all humanity, of modern culture as a whole. They will not get perceived. They will get boxed in as being, black pride, check out this artist. It shouldn't be the case. This is not how this operates. We shouldn't put those confines on this music. And I find that really difficult to deal with when I'm trying to negotiate myself through talking about this. Anyway, I hope that sort of explains my position. I haven't got into the philosophical underpinnings of critical theory and postmodernist ideas of power, and also identitarianism and intersectionality. I haven't got into that, but I have studied it, and I think the philosophy is fundamentally flawed. I don't think it logically follows or works, and I think this is why at the moment culturally we are having such a problem with these things mixing together. Right, that's my daughter. It's coming to see me. I think that's a sign that I should finish there, isn't it? You know. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like, subscribe and all that sort of stuff. And if you do want to discuss this, let's try to have it as friendly and as nice as we possibly can without slinging mud, which often happens as soon as you bring this up. So let's have a nice conversation down below about this, and thanks for watching.